Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Ruth Leftwich. I'm the Director of Learning at the Senator John Heinz History Center. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for a program called From Exclusion to Autonomy, the History and Future of Accessible Transportation. We appreciate you being here tonight for our program that's offered in commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the ADA. And we're excited to dive into a topic that is important in our region and nationally this evening. A few notes about the program tonight. You will see that we have ASL interpretation this evening, which is going to be provided by the Center for Hearing and Deaf Services. We also have live captioning available, provided by ACS captioners. You can access that by clicking on the closed caption box at the bottom of your screen. That will be available throughout the whole evening. We will have two panels tonight, and at the end of each one, there'll be an opportunity for questions from our audience. You can use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen by clicking on that and asking questions using the chat. We will answer those questions for each panel and then have a little discussion at the end as well. If you need any kind of technical support or help this evening, you can use the chat box. And if you want to open that, you'll notice that throughout the program, we'll be including notes and a range of different resources that you can explore after our program. So thank you again for joining us. And now I would like to introduce Mary Hartley, the Project Director of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium, a longtime partner of the History Center, who we are super happy to have with us this evening to kick off the program. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, welcome everybody. Good evening. The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium brings together multiple disability organizations and partners with Achieva, the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, and Heinz History Center, working to preserve and honor the historic struggle of people with disabilities to attain human and civil rights and to share the lived experience of today in order to promote community access, participation, and equal opportunity. The struggle for disability rights has only recently been recognized as part of the American history. In many locations, including here in our community, the dramatic changes that have occurred over the past 60 or 70 years have not been sufficiently documented, preserved, or shared. Please check out our website, which will be listed in the chat. It serves as a clearinghouse for historic collections, repositories, and resources. We are always working to identify important materials that could be linked to our site or preserved and shared. If you or someone you know or your organization have materials related to any aspect of disability history, we encourage you to complete the survey that can be found on our website. We are grateful for the support of the Trees Charitable Trust and the FISA Foundation for this event and so many others. Now, I'd like to introduce John Tague, who is not only a founding member of our consortium, but its first project director. John is a leader in transportation advocacy in Pennsylvania. He was a member of the Allegheny County Transit Council, which advises the Port Authority on transit issues, has served on the Committee for Accessible Transportation, a group that advises the Port Authority on access on issues affecting riders with disabilities and older adults. He currently serves on the board of the Port Authority of Allegheny County and is chair of the Planning and Stakeholders Committee. He also chairs the Pennsylvania Transportation Alliance, a grassroots transportation advocacy organization. John supported efforts for the Pennsylvania Rural Shared Ride Program for people with disabilities, ensuring there was paratransit service throughout the Commonwealth. Welcome, John.
Good evening, folks. Thank you, Mary. Good evening, folks. I was asked by the Heinz History Center to introduce our program this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing from our expert panelists. This evening, we are celebrating the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Transportation is an integral part of the Act. Transportation is about independence. Accessible transportation makes it possible for individuals with disabilities to live independently in their communities. 50 years ago, accessible, affordable transportation was just becoming available, especially for individuals needing lift-equipped vehicles. But if you lived in a rural community, it was next to impossible to find. Our transit system has evolved over the past 50 years, and we have an active disability community that continues to advocate for better accessible transportation. When I was younger, I walked to most places or got a ride from my parents, so I never thought about accessible transportation. I drove for 40 years before it became unsafe for me and others due to my diagnosis of muscular dystrophy. I then began to notice inaccessible transportation features as I relied more on public transportation. This spurred me to get involved in local, state, and national transit advocacy, which has continued for the past 24 years. Accessible transportation is critical to the quality of life of individuals with disabilities. However, that is only part of the story. The larger story is really about mobility, the ability to move around your community, the opportunity to work or volunteer, to attend religious services, and to fully participate in community activities, including public hearings on transportation. We've made progress over the past 30 years, but the full realization of this landmark civil rights legislation has yet to be achieved in Pittsburgh and beyond. 3 decades after the ADA's passage, the story of mobility in Pittsburgh is still one of poorly maintained sidewalks, a lack of curb ramps, barriers created by sidewalk cafes, obstructed restaurant sandwich boards, and a lack of inclusive planning. As we'll learn in this evening's program, there is no substitute for a well-informed, dedicated, passionate, and persistent advocates. In recent years, we've lost several great advocates, most recently, Linda Dickerson. I would like to acknowledge some folks that helped me better understand accessible transportation, Ruth Brenyo and Lucy Sproul, as well as Bob Smith and Jeff Parker. I also learned from many of our panelists as well. Addressing the remaining challenges to mobility in Pittsburgh requires advocacy and activism, as was needed for the passage of the ADA. This evening, we'll hear experienced transit advocates and nationally recognized scholars reflect on the history and future of accessible transportation in our region. Our program will feature 2 panels. The first panel will explore the unique community-driven innovations in transportation for people with disabilities that was forged in our city. We learned how a group of Pittsburghers with disabilities created their own transit service at a time when no accessible transportation existed. Our panel will then dig into the rich collaboration and community input that shaped the network of accessible buses and paratransit vehicles we have today. The panel will then explore the limitations and challenges they face before finishing with a discussion on ongoing accessibility issues in transportation and mobility. The second panel will carry the thread into the discussion of current and future challenges and opportunities in accessible self-driving car development and the larger quest for autonomy in transportation and mobility. These panels will be followed by questions and answer session. So please submit your questions to the Q&A feature throughout the program. Before diving into the panels, we are pleased to share the premiere of a short film about the lifelong advocacy of the late Paul Dick, a master advocate for accessible transportation. Paul, a native of Blair County, helped create the county's accessible access transportation program, one of the largest coordinated transportation systems and a model for the rest of the nation. When I watched this video, I was thinking about Paul. I first met Paul in the late 70s, and it had nothing to do with disability or transportation. It was in his role as Vice President of Human Resources at St. Francis Health System. Years later, I reconnected with him when I became a transportation advocate at Three Rivers Center for Independent Living. I recall a conversation with Paul about the need for accessible paratransit. There were those in the disability community that just believed in having accessible buses and light rail service. Paul argued there was need for a paratransit for people with disabilities who are unable or have limited ability because of their disability to use fixed route buses or light rail services. I remember Paul telling me that he had the opportunity to testify before Congress in support of making our buses and light rail services accessible, while also providing a robust paratransit service. While it came much later, the ADA affirmed Paul's vision. The act required that the fixed route transit be accessible and that paratransit services be comparable to fixed route buses and light rail service. A bit of background on Paul. Paul contracted polio at age 14 and in the mid-1950s. Even as a teen, Paul recognized that transportation was a major barrier for people with disabilities. Over 55 years, his advocacy career focused on the vision of accessible public transportation that operated as a collaboration between the government and the citizens who use it. The film is a production of Voices of Change multimedia project of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium and is available on the consortium's website. Paul Dick's papers and photographs were housed in the collection of the Detry Library and Archives here at the Heinz History Center. Without further ado, we present the video premiere of Voices of Change, the story of Paul Dick, accessible transportation advocate.
In 1954, when I had polio, I was a 14-year-old boy, lived out in the country, and when it came Christmas time, I was to make a trip home, just for the day, to spend with my family. And the only way they could take me from Altoona Hospital to my home, which was about 20 miles away, was by ambulance, because there was no other way to travel. I ran about 80 miles an hour or so with the siren going. For them, it was kind of a hoot. And I remember thinking then, there's got to be a better way to do this. So it goes way back then.
Paul Dick was diagnosed at age 14 with polio. His own desire to live a fully mobile life ultimately led him to work for an early system of accessible transportation that has had a lasting impact on the lives of countless others living with physical disabilities. These efforts helped lay the foundation for the Access Transportation System, a paratransit network that has made it possible for thousands of people in Allegheny County to attend college, work, and live independently. Paul's involvement in transportation advocacy spanned over a 55-year period and has reshaped our transit infrastructure. What factors in Paul's own life motivated him to advocate for mass transit solutions that provide access to everyone? As a teenager, Paul took several trips to Warm Springs, a polio treatment facility founded by one of history's most noteworthy individuals with polio, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was fortunate to have support from his friends and family. When Paul returned to high school, friends lifted him up and down school stairways. Undeterred by the physical and societal barriers in his way, Paul enrolled at Elizabethtown College in 1959. He used his National Merit Scholarship to pay fellow students to assist with getting in and out of inaccessible buildings on campus. When Paul joined the workforce in the 1960s, he continued to face transportation obstacles head-on.
When I went to work every day, I had to take a taxi cab, which was a little expensive, not to mention inconvenient, because there were times when it'd take a good while to get a cab. And even though I was on a list of people that they picked up regularly, I didn't have to call every day. Sometimes they'd show up half hour late or an hour late, and in bad weather it was not an easy thing.
By the 1970s, Paul had been appointed to the Federal Commission on Accessible Transportation and locally helped found Open Doors for the Handicapped and Magic Carpet Transportation. Magic Carpet transported over 85,000 people in its first 7 years of operation.
We recognized that that was a real issue and decided to start then what ended up being called Magic Carpet Transportation Service. basically a private paratransit service operated, not-for-profit, operated by consumers.
Magic Carpet would go on to form the foundation of the Access Transportation System, which celebrates its 40th anniversary in 2019, having provided over 66 million rides. Access service is provided in 4 to 15-seat passenger vehicles, including lift-equipped vans and sedans, owned, operated, and maintained by access service providers. Paul Dick led the charge to elevate the needs of everyday citizens and create policies for sustainable and accessible transportation systems across the United States. With 300 plus vehicles, Access now averages 5,000 trips per weekday.
He did a lot of work at a national level with setting standards for housing and public buildings for facilities to accommodate people in wheelchairs and all sorts of things like that, as well as public transportation. So he was a constant inspiration, and we worked well together, and I think he was probably one of the primary influences in my life.
His legacy to increase access to transportation serves as a reminder for all who strive to make society more equitable and to persist, regardless of the obstacles that may come their way.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sierra Green, and I work as an archivist at the Heinz History Center, and I'm also a steering committee member of the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. I'm here this evening just to provide a little bit of background as to how this program came to be. We at the History Center have partnered with the consortium since 2015. And we share in the organization's mission to preserve and share the historic struggles of Western Pennsylvanians with disabilities to attain human and civil rights. A foundational part of this work is identifying the stories that form this history. I can't underscore enough the importance of consortium members in this process. These history-minded folks from Pittsburgh's disability advocacy community know and have lived this history, so they're perfectly situated to lead in this work. And one of the key stories that emerged fairly early on in these discussions was around the local history of transportation and mobility. When we as archivists and curators learn of a new through line in history, we go on the lookout for historical materials that reflect and provide further insights into these stories. The consortium was integral to connecting us with the people and the sources to understand this history. And just like those of you here tonight that are new to this story, I first came to learn about accessible transportation through the history of Paul Dick. I was profoundly moved by Paul and other transportation advocates' simple but profound assertion that reliable and affordable accessible transportation plays an integral role in pursuing a fulfilling life. Their memories of the barriers that they faced and the solutions that they forged opened whole new lines of thinking for me. And the more that I spoke with people who shaped this region's system of accessible transportation, the more that I observed the truly incredible stories of collaboration and inclusion that created nationally significant innovation and progress. At the outset, though, I had a key question, and it's a simple one. How did we transform from a Pittsburgh of the 1960s in which Paul Dick had to use a taxi to get back and forth from his job and his graduate internship into a city that today has accessible buses and a robust paratransit service? This is the key question that I'm excited for our first panel to take on. And connected with this, we'll tackle a second question too. What can this case study from history teach us as we continue in our collective endeavor to pursue and fulfill the promises of the ADA. I'm so honored to welcome our first panelists, Holly Dick, Karen Hesh, and Paulo Hanlon. Holly Dick became legally blind at the age of 6. During her 44 years of marriage to E. Paul Dick, a noted disability advocate, she worked closely with him as a member of the 504 Advisory Committee and his successor, the Committee for Accessible Transportation, of which she is still a member. A former Access Community Liaison, Holly retired in 2012. Since then, she has been a member of the City of Pittsburgh's Planning Commission. She currently serves on advisory committees to the Allegheny County Area Agency for the Aging and the Port Authority of Allegheny County, among others. Karen Hesh is Executive Director of Access Transportation Systems. In this capacity, she oversees the daily operations of Access, one of the largest paratransit brokerage programs in the United States. Access, sponsored by the Port Authority of Allegheny County, is known for its high-level coordination and its ADA paratransit eligibility determination process, which is a national model. She has conducted technical assistance and workshops on the ADA and transportation coordination for transit agencies and statewide public transit association conferences. Karen has been with Access since 1979. Paul W. O. Hanlon is a 1979 graduate of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. For 14 years, he worked for a disability rights law firm where he specialized in housing, voting, and transportation. Before that, O'Hanlon was senior housing attorney with Neighborhood Legal Services Association in Pittsburgh, where he worked for more than 20 years. O'Hanlon served in a leadership capacity on several local and state disability advocacy advisory bodies, as well as nonpartisan voting coalitions. He is active in local advocacy efforts concerning disability, poverty, housing, transportation, and voting issues. Before we dive in, I want to be sure to frame this panel as a case study. I've learned that issues surrounding transportation and mobility for people with disabilities in the past and the present are vast, and sadly, we don't have the time and the space to get to all of them in this first panel. All the same, what we will explore, I believe, is a powerful case study from which we can learn to tackle contemporary issues facing mobility and transportation. So let's dig in. Holly, we learned some of the transportation challenges that Paul faced as a graduate student and early professional at Pitt. You, of course, were a Pitt grad student around the same time. What barriers did people with disabilities face getting around the city in the 1960s?
Well, Paul and I came together to graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh to be trained as rehabilitation counselors. That was in 1963. And there was almost no accessibility in the area at that time. Paul was in one of the earliest dormitories, Litchfield Towers, that was accessible, but his transportation options were almost non-existent. There were no curb cuts in Pittsburgh. Paul had no electric wheelchair. In fact, I don't think there were many electric wheelchairs available at that time. So he had to be pushed around by someone else, and the chair had to be tilted backwards by another person to get him up on a curb after he crossed a street. There were no accessible buses there, and because you had to be able to walk up and down the steps of a bus to be able to ride it. There were no accessible cabs at that time, and certainly there was no paratransit such as Access. So these were all things that we had to work on to develop for the future. Likewise, for me as a blind, at that time, somewhat quite visually impaired, but I had a little more vision than I do now, that I was able to use a bus, but because I could walk up and down its steps. But the signs in the front of the bus to identify its routes were not really discernible to me because of my visual problem. And drivers of the buses at that time were not mandated to identify the route that they were driving. You had to ask them to do so. And I remember running up and down the long line of buses, which pulled into a busy bus stop many, many times to find the bus that I really needed. I remember once downtown, I asked a driver if it was such and such a bus to go to East End, and I thought he said yes. And when I got on the bus and he was going, I realized it was going across the Fort Pitt Bridge and headed for the airport.
Oh
so
my gosh.
I had to transfer a very dangerous intersection to get on the other side to get back to Pittsburgh. Likewise, there were no Braille bus labels or plates on buses at that time. That sounds like a silly little thing, but if a visually impaired person wants to file a complaint on a bus or a bus driver, the person needs to know the number of the bus, and that's something we came up with much later. And we also worked on getting bus schedules. At that time, there was no indication that bus schedules should be easily readable by someone with a visual impairment, and so on. So we really, and likewise, there were no accommodations for people with other kinds of disabilities, such as intellectual disability, severe mental health problems, or a traumatic brain injury or autism. So we've done a lot of work to make buses accessible and to develop a paratransit system which can be used by people with all kinds of disabilities. Thank you.
Oh, Holly, that's just such an incredibly thoughtful answer. And we appreciate so much you taking the time to kind of set the stage and really look at the barriers that people with disabilities faced during that period in the 1960s. So as we were digging in and learning more about this story at the History Center, what truly amazes me in this narrative is what happens next. So rather than accepting these unreliable alternatives to accessible transportation, a group of disabled Pittsburghers, they just go out and they create their own solution. And that solution is called Magic Carpet. And it's really thanks to Paul Dick that we at the History Center came to learn more about Magic Carpet. And sadly, the story of the people that know the story best of Magic Carpet in its early days, many of them have since passed away, including Edna Anish, David Latanza, and Ruth and George Brennio. Thankfully, though, we have records that were donated by the organization that created Magic Carpet, and they provide a little bit of a glimpse into this incredible community-derived solution to accessible transportation challenges. And just to show a piece that helped us learn more about this history. So what we have here is a brochure from 1971 that it's the earliest brochure that was made to advertise this community-derived solution, this transportation service predominantly for people with physical disabilities. So it was created in 1970, and some of its key features tried to serve some of the problems that Holly highlighted. Predominantly, again, for people with physical disabilities, the van that is depicted within this brochure has a cap on top of it that is kind of like a pickup truck. And the van itself was actually equipped to have 4 people in wheelchairs as well as 4 attendants ride within the van. And most importantly, it actually had features so that people could ride in the comfort of their own wheelchairs. They didn't have to transfer from their wheelchair to a seat within the vehicle. There was an anchoring system. And then also the vans had a hydraulic lift. And in this image, we have either an attendant or a driver assisting the person in a wheelchair coming down from the van, and then there's another person who is opening the door to the van. So a couple of features of this transportation service that were incredible is the lift, the anchoring, as well too. Magic Carpet, the people that created Magic Carpet, they recognized the need to support transportation from the person's home to the van, and then from the van to their ultimate destination and back. And so there was a level of support that really recognized the challenges in transportation and mobility that people with physical disabilities were facing at that time. There were some other key characteristics of Magic Carpet too that we want to highlight. It was also very important for the people that organized Magic Carpet that it be affordable. So just looking at the numbers, it was anywhere from 25 to 60% cheaper than taxi service to take advantage of Magic Carpet. And if you were someone who wanted to utilize the service, you just had to call and you could set up regular support for transportation. It operated initially 7 days a week, and then they tracked it back a little bit to 5 days a week. And it started as a smaller operation, but over time, they actually grew quite a bit to operating 6 vans within the first 6 years of service. And they provided over 80,000 rides, which is just astounding thinking about the scale of that. So I wanted to be sure to highlight this incredible community-derived solution. And there were so many lessons learned over these years. Now, when I was learning more about this story, Karen helped kind of learn more about the role of the taxi companies as a part of this bigger narrative. She helped me recognize that Magic Carpet was not operating in a vacuum. So Karen, I have a question for you. So what was the nature of the local taxi industry's relationship with Magic Carpet? And at the time, what was problematic about taxi service as a means of transportation for people with physical disabilities?
Thank you. Let me start by apologizing that I don't have a photo displayed, and you shouldn't read anything into that except that the fact that I am continue to be challenged by technology. So in the mid-70s, believe it or not, there were 12 taxi companies operating in Pittsburgh, and most of them were providing some kind of service to people with disabilities, either through contracts for school transportation or through the kind of service that Holly described, where the driver would actually fold up the wheelchair, put it in the trunk, and help lift the passenger in and out of the cab. The taxi industry was a very robust, thriving industry at that time. There is some additional history, though, about access that coalesces with the taxi companies. So let me give you if I may, a quick history trip so that you can see the road that we've traveled on to get to where we are. It goes back to 1973 to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 504, which essentially prevented agencies that received federal funding from discriminating against people with disabilities. In 1976, the federal government issued some preliminary regulations impacting transportation and requiring communities to start to think about special efforts to make their systems accessible. So that's when the taxi industry, Magic Carpet, the human service transportation providers, and the local advocates got together to start to think about what kind of transportation service would work the best in Pittsburgh. At the same time, the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission, which was the Metropolitan Planning Organization, released its Transportation Improvement Plan and recommended that the accessible transportation solution in Allegheny County be a coordinated paratransit system. That same year, Carnegie Mellon University received a grant from the Urban Mass Transit Administration, which was called a Service and Methods Demonstration Grant, to examine service models for paratransit. In addition to looking at paratransit, they were charged with figuring out ways to improve the fixed route system for people with disabilities. So some of the initial challenges that Holly talked about were to have been mitigated or addressed as far back as 1976, including things like lighting, handrails, buses that knelt, and most importantly, driver sensitivity, which Holly addressed. CMU was also charged to develop a model for a coordinated paratransit system, which was encouraged at that time by the federal government. In talking with consumers locally, they already were familiar with the concept of paratransit because of Magic Carpet, and they liked it. It worked for them. It worked for them because, like Holly said, the pedestrian environment was challenging. There were no curb cuts. We have hills. We have snow. The buses run in the river valleys and the people live up the sides of the hills. So paratransit looked like a good opportunity to demonstrate a mobility option that was a little bit different than what they were doing in other communities. At the same time, the idea was to use these existing taxi companies that were already operating in the community and Magic Carpet and human service agencies to actually provide the transportation. So in a way, it was bringing a lot of diverse entities together. In 1977, then, that UMTA grant that Carnegie Mellon received transferred to Port Authority. And we had the blessing in that year of having Bill Millar come to Pittsburgh from PennDOT to start the Access program. And at his side was Tom Letke. They were the yin and yang of Port Authority, and they had tremendous passion for starting this transportation program. They were definitely our genies in the bottle. So between 1978 and 1979, Port Authority worked with CMU and most importantly with what at that time was called the Elderly and Handicapped Advisory Committee of Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission. And they were the advocates and consumers and agency representatives that put their heads together and said, what do we want this to look like? In 1979, they launched Access. I have been told that the Access is an acronym. You'll notice it's all capital letters, and I've been told that the name was developed by a employee on a plane trip to Pittsburgh who wrote it on the back of a napkin, and it's like the Gettysburg Address, right? It stands for Allegheny County Coordinated Effort for Shared Ride Service. It still maintains the broker model. The taxis bought in. Magic Carpet was in the system, but the eligibility for the program was strictly limited to people with physical disabilities who would have benefited if there were a lift on a bus. So even though it was a great expansive experiment, it excluded a lot of people with disabilities. There was a court challenge and a decision to the requirement to put lifts on buses. And at the end of 1979, the Port Authority was permitted to move ahead using Access as its local option with buy-in from the community. From there, we moved to 1986, where the 504 rules were tightened a little more. The eligibility started to expand. And in 1990, we finally had the ADA. And between 1992 and 1997, we worked to come into full compliance with the ADA and still have the very strong and passionate commitment of Port Authority to support this service.
Karen, I really, I appreciate so much that chronology and laying out kind of the story and the detail as far as what we're going to explore with the rest of our time with the panel this evening. So one of the features of this process of creating this new system that leveraged the taxi companies and the services that they were providing, leveraged Magic Carpet and the paratransit model system that they had created to serve themselves and to serve their constituents, a key part of the creation of this system, as you mentioned, was the input from community members, input from people who had been involved in Magic Carpet and other community members. So I know, Holly, you were a member of this committee, of this group that gave input to the Port Authority to shape this system. So I wonder if you might reflect on those experiences collaborating with the Port Authority, because what I gather is that they were just, those were really special times, and I'd love your reflections.
Okay, yeah, they were special times. I worked with both the committee, the 504 committee and the Committee for Accessible Transportation, which is known as CAT. And over those years, which were many, many years of working on, there were certain principles that emerged and things that we learned and things that we utilized in formulating a system of accessible transportation in Pittsburgh. The first one is we listened well to each other. The Port Authority had excellent listeners in Bill Millar and Tom Letke, and also Access had some excellent listeners. He hasn't been mentioned so far, but Irvin Rosner was the person from CMU who actually, along with some help from his colleagues at CMU, designed the Access system. And he became its chief executive officer at the beginning of Access, and he held that position until about 2000, when he received a heart transplant and gave up his executive position to Karen Hesh, and his able assistant for many, many, many years. And then he became its chief executive officer. Irvin didn't like public speaking, was not comfortable with it. So he often sat in the back of the room, but he listened very carefully to what our needs were and worked diligently to make sure they were implemented. And certainly Karen has been an excellent listener all these years, by email, in person, in any way that she possibly could. The second, I think, is the result of listening to each other, the disability community listening to Port Authority and vice versa. We developed a lot of mutual respect for one another. And this served well in our collaborative efforts over many, many years. A third point, I think, is that we in the disability community learned to understand each other's disabilities and to cooperate with each other. We weren't selfish in saying that I'm only interested in those things that help me as a blind person or me as a person in a wheelchair, etc. We recognize each other's needs. Just very quickly, a modern example of this is several months ago, Paula Hanlon noticed that the city was putting neighbor ways or small roundabouts on streets in East Liberty. And he very quickly realized that these were not good for people who were blind people and elderly people who were crossing the streets in this area, and pointed out the problems. And we all worked together from the disability community with the city to try to overcome some of these problems and make sure that future neighbor ways would be made accessible. So that, I think those principles still continuing. We at the disability community worked closely with the Port Authority whenever the Port Authority needed help in lobbying for funding, which was all too frequently with our state legislature. And we knew how to tell the personal stories that really do affect positively the legislators. So we've done that a number of times, and I think it's with pretty good success. But there's always an ongoing problem with funding. As a result of this work, we've developed, I think, lifelong advocates in Pittsburgh, which is kind of unusual for a city. Many of the people who started out with Magic Carpet worked well into the years with access with the CAT. And most of them worked until they got too ill to do so, or they passed away. And then many of the people who worked in those early years have continued to work. And I guess I'm probably the oldest one that's still left, myself and Joyce Driven. But we really, I think, have felt we were dedicated to that work. And as I look back on the work we did over the years, I always say to people that indeed in Pittsburgh, we had sit-downs rather than sit-ins. We had no real lawsuits or huge demonstrations or anything. We had hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of hours of really hard work in meetings between the disability community and the Port Authority and Access. So I think we have set an example that has been followed and will be followed throughout the country and in many ways throughout the world of how groups can work together to get something done positively. Thank you.
Holly, thank you so much for those reflections. And just thinking about particularly this foundation of this long-term collaboration between the Port Authority and community members and Access, I would love to just swivel and ask Karen, can you point to, thinking about these early conversations, this early collaboration, can you point to specific characteristics of Access as a paratransit system that you really credit to the people that were affiliated with Magic Carpet, the community members who were involved in shaping what it looked like?
Absolutely. You mentioned one of them in your opening remarks, and that is looking at transportation not as the vehicle, but as a total trip. What are the transportation elements and amenities that make it possible for people to use the service to get all the way from point A to point B as independently as possible? It's also a system that's very person-centered. It's a big system, but we know people by name. That's very important. It was important to Magic Carpet. And we have a philosophy that every trip matters. It doesn't matter where you're going or why you're going there. We want you to be able to do that with choice and with dignity as independently as possible. We did learn from our mistakes. Accessible fixed route service does work. And Ruth Brenyo, many years ago, advocated for a combination of both modes. And we've done that very well here. So we've learned that the paratransit and fixed route service can be a complement to each other. We've learned that coordination makes the system stronger. Magic Carpet believed in that from the very beginning. There are 140 agencies that purchase service from Access. The door-to-door element, including assistance up or down steps, was a founding principle of Magic Carpet and continues with Access. And I believe we are the only system left in the United States that actually assists people up or down steps to get to and from vehicles. Low fares were extremely important. People with disabilities, unfortunately, have still a very high rate of unemployment and very little disposable income. So it was important that people not be limited by affordability of service in the choices of where they could go and participate in community life. The whole notion of reasonable modification was baked into Access in the beginning. If there's something about the service that doesn't work for you, if you talk with us about it, we'll see if there's a workaround. The quality of service was important, and we continue to meet or exceed standards for that in the areas of driver training, service quality. We have a cashless, contactless fare system, so we were way ahead of our time before we knew it. And most importantly, there should be a seat for everyone in the Access system. That's what Magic Carpet was about. How can we use transportation to link people to the community that where they choose to be? And those core values we were all very pleased to see were ultimately reflected in the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially in the areas of fares, reasonable modification, and origin to destination transportation. So those Magic Carpet and elderly and handicapped committee advocates were extremely visionary in their time.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that. We really appreciate it. Up until this point in our narrative, we've talked about the aftermath of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, the first time in which Port Authority really had to respond and provide accessible transportation. But as Karen highlighted, there were limitations to just providing accessibility to it via the paratransit service. It needed to be expanded to buses as well and to light rail. And so that's when the ADA comes in, and that is when Paul O'Hanlon, our last panelist, comes onto the scene. So Paul, if you could chime in here, would you mind sharing how and when you got involved with transportation advocacy and the issues that were facing public transportation, the buses and the paratransit service at the time?
Sure. Hi. Well, I was, so the ADA passed in 1990, and in 1992, the regulations were promulgated, the federal regulations that created a legal requirement for accessible fixed route bus systems. And in 1990, I remember, so I had been practicing law for, I guess, about 12 years at that point, and doing all of my traveling to and from courts and district justice offices using Access because I couldn't get onto a bus. And but I had one experience with an accessible bus in California. So in 1990, when Pittsburgh started getting their very first accessible buses, I was really excited, kind of imagining the possibilities. Little did I know, though, that when the federal regulations were passed, because it required not only fixed route buses, but it required paratransit to serve people that here in Pittsburgh we had never served. You know, it required paratransit to serve people with intellectual disabilities, you know, autism, a whole range of disabilities that we just sort of didn't recognize before, because, you know, we had sort of like this test, can you walk up the steps of a bus? And if you failed that test, you were eligible for access. So obviously lots of people with different disabilities could walk up steps, but they couldn't necessarily use the bus system. And so when Port Authority kind of first projected, what does this mean to Port Authority? They imagined that they would be inundated with thousands of new riders, taking hundreds of thousands of new trips, and projected these budget costs kind of out of range of what they could afford. And so Port Authority's first reaction was to shrink back the service that they were going to offer to the federal minimum. And that meant that large areas of the outer county would have had no service at all. And it was sort of a brutal shock to those of us that were excited by the ADA that it was going to mean something better. And here it was that we were presented with this reality that they were going to shrink back the service. And so that was when I got involved. So, and I went to the first public meeting. So of course, Port Authority has to have a public hearing if they're going to implement a change. They had a public hearing on these new service criteria. And I went to that public hearing and it was packed. I mean, there were hundreds of people in wheelchairs. Everybody was there. Everybody was really freaked out about what this was going to do. And it was an interesting public hearing because in the course of it, essentially what we challenged Port Authority to do was to work with us so that the number of people coming onto the access system would be equaled by the number of people leaving the access system to use the fixed route buses that would be accessible. And so we kind of set up this kind of challenge to work with us and not do this draconian kind of cut that they were projecting. So that was kind of the setting, and that's when I got involved.
No, that's just, it's such a those are wonderful reflections of this like really important period. And I know that there are so many powerful examples of what came as a result of what became a multi-year partnership. I'm wondering, Paul, before we conclude, if you could just share, just like one example of something that came out of this partnership of working with the Accessible Transportation Work Group that you established and collaborating with Port Authority.
Well, I think that there are, I would say there's two things. Number one, and it goes back to what both Holly and Karen were saying, there was a history of the disability community working together. And we literally sat down as a community and priced out, well, okay, if the ADA requires this, can we delay that in order to keep this? And it was sort of like Bill Millar gave us the luxury of playing with the public transit system and becoming responsible for it. And I think that that's partly why, Holly was saying it built lifelong advocates. Public transit belongs to us. It needs a certain number of people in the community to act like they own it. And so I think that that's kind of how we behaved. We made a number of sacrifices in order to get commitments from Port Authority. And the one thing that I guess the second thing that came out of that was that Lucy Sproul and I were very involved in this process. And we were also at the state level on something called the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. And the DD Council was looking at the whole state of Pennsylvania because the ADA created transportation options only where they already existed. So the cities had a kind of transportation solution from the ADA, but the areas of the rural parts of Pennsylvania that did not have a fixed route system, it offered them nothing. And so Lucy and I then started a project that involved eventually Bob Schmidt, and it was something that led to the statewide shared ride program, which now serves the whole state. And it was really, I think, out of our experience with working with Port Authority and building an accessible system that kind of led to that.
No, and Paul, I appreciate your words so much, and I think it's a perfect way to conclude this first panel, is just really recognizing the ripple effects and that resulted from this long-term partnership and meaningful, mutually respectful, inclusive partnership between policymakers and system makers and community members who shared from their lived experiences to really shape and evolve systems in a way that honors the needs of their constituents. So I just appreciate that so much. And I want to make sure that we have a couple minutes set aside here for some question and answers at the conclusion of this first panel. So I think Mary Ruth is going to help us out with that.
Sarah, thank you. And that was an amazing panel. I think that what we are going to do at the moment, we just had one person kind of pop something in that is a reflection that says, isn't it odd to realize that there was a time when you couldn't be sure that there was a way to get a wheelchair onto a bus that you wanted to take? And I think that that's a really interesting thing to maybe kind of reflect on for a moment, and a great segue then to our second panel, looking at the future of disability. So if you guys want to reflect on that a little bit more for a second, I think that would be helpful as a transition of the time span between.
Well, I mean, not only could you not get on the bus in a wheelchair, but I can tell you, I had some crazy friends in college that got me onto the bus, but then you discovered there was no place for you. So, you know, if you were in a wheelchair in a bus in those days, you're basically blocking the whole aisle because nothing was set up to accommodate a wheelchair.
And I can remember, of course, I rode with Paul when they first started making the buses accessible. And that was a real trip, I'll tell you. Many times the lift wouldn't work, or several times he got, you know, he was on the bus and he went to get off and the lift wouldn't work to come down. And we had to have a lot of brawny drivers come and lift him off the bus. So in those days, it was a hairy kind of thing until you got great deal of reliability into them. And also when you had the ramps that you could lower down, replaced the hydraulic lifts on the bus.
In some ways, it's just as crazy to think about the fact that throughout the 80s, we were thinking, why would anyone with a disability using a wheelchair want to get on a bus? They must be nuts. When we have this excellent segregated paratransit service that they can use. So boy, were we wrong about that.
Well, and we will come back to some more questions. I think an interesting segue from that original question, she mentioned that she is a person with vision loss and she keeps track of where she's going now using her smartphone to keep track of stops on the bus, not using paying attention to things like onboard announcements. So I think that's a great way for us to now think about the future and then come back to some questions at the end that all of our panelists can reflect on. So thank you all so much for our first panel. And I am now going to introduce Ann Mataraz, who is our chief historian and the director of our curatorial vision at the Heinz History Center. And she's going to introduce our second group of panelists to talk about the future of accessible transportation.
Thanks so much, Mary Ruth. What an excellent first panel. And I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for the second part of our evening. I'm going to give shortened introductions, and if you're looking for more information about each of the panelists, please look for their bios in the chat. Dr. Cooper is FISA Foundation and Paralyzed Veterans of America Distinguished Professor at the University of Pittsburgh and Director of the Human Engineering Research Laboratories at Pitt. Recently, he was named as the lead researcher of a national study about the accessibility of autonomous transportation for people with disabilities funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Our second panelist, Dr. Rebecca A. Greer, is a UX, user experience researcher who's worked for 20 years in business sectors that include healthcare, defense, telecommunications, and automotive. Dr. Greer chairs the National SAE Task Force on identifying autonomous driving system dedicated vehicle user issues for persons with disabilities. Our third panelist, Dr. Aaron Steinfeld, is an associate research professor at the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. His specialties are human-robot interaction and advanced transportation, and he's served as the co-director of the Rehabilitation Engineering Research Center on Accessible Public Transport. Good evening, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us. As Mary Ruth said, we just heard an interesting discussion of a very community-based model of advocacy and change. Each of you are working with advanced technologies now, and the application of those technologies, be they robotics, artificial intelligence, automation, software, and so much more to this issue of accessibility. Can you talk about both the challenges of bringing technology to transportation and the opportunities that it offers?
So from a perspective of autonomous vehicles, they will open up the doors because for many people, because you will not have to have a driver's license when level 4 and level 5 vehicles, those that are fully autonomous and do not have to have a human takeover, so there are no steering controls, no braking controls in them. However, for that to happen, automotive companies have to design vehicles very differently than they have in the past. They have not considered all of the wonderful things we've learned in the last 30 years to make software and human-computer interfaces accessible to a wide range of individuals. So things like the World Wide Web Accessibility Consortium has a wonderful set of guidance. Section 508 has a wonderful set of guidance, all of which makes technology accessible. But automotive engineers haven't had to consider that in their interfaces before, because they've always considered their customers to have all of their capabilities. So that's the first issue. The second issue with autonomous vehicles, that's even a larger one, is the idea of onboarding and offboarding, where the person gets into the vehicle, where the person gets out of the vehicle. What makes an accessible location for someone to get into a vehicle or out of a vehicle is very much dependent upon their disability. And the infrastructure that exists currently creates challenges. And there are wonderful people working on these challenges, and they're surmountable, but it takes people actually thinking about this community in the design of the vehicle and the software that runs the vehicle for it to actually assist this community.
Aaron, Rory, do you want to address the same question?
Sure. So I want to kind of leapfrog off of what was just mentioned about, it's not just about the vehicles itself, it's also about the complete trip. And so one of the big challenges that shows up quite a lot in transportation is, while a vehicle might be accessible, getting to that vehicle or getting from that vehicle to where you need to go is not. So for example, here in the Allegheny County, a common problem is, for example, sidewalks not being properly maintained, or snow on the sidewalks and so forth. And so these are the sorts of areas where innovations in information technology can really make a big difference on whether or not a person can do what's called a complete trip. So the idea that going from where you are to where you want to go is more than just the vehicle that you ride in. And this is where things get really complicated when you start talking about a city like Pittsburgh with all of our hills, all of our tree-lined streets with routes going through sidewalks, but it also shows up in the urban infrastructure. So for example, if you have an automated vehicle that's going to pick up and drop off people, if there's no attendant in the vehicle, that may not necessarily be accessible for a person who needs door-to-door service. So these are the sorts of complete trip problems that the future is really looking at, and a lot of people are trying to spend a lot of time on. Rory?
I'm sure. I agree with all of those things, but also I think you don't even need full autonomy. If I can give a little plug for Amy Lane and the Center for Assistive Technology, right? Amy has a vehicle that people can learn to drive on now, and Aaron and I know because we worked with Amy when we had the Qualt Center between Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. And one of the things that struck me when I first met her was that most of her job was actually taking people's driver's licenses away. You would think with the title of adaptive driving instructor that you'd be helping people to drive. But in fact, it is that, you know, most people as they acquire disability are as they age and acquire disabilities, they wind up losing their licenses. And so even partial autonomy, right? Things like we might not even think of that these people that can drive don't think about, right? ABS braking, and lane control, and actually now self-parking vehicles. All of those that are not at the full level of autonomy that we hope to see in the future, which I think will be tremendously empowering, are with us today and are allowing more older adults and more people with disabilities to continue to drive or to drive for the first time. So I think that's something we want to keep in mind as well.
I agree fully that a lot of the driver assist technologies are helping a large number of people drive further. My concern is a lot of people think of Teslas, which are a high level 2, low level 3 as autonomous vehicles. And I personally would never get into one of those vehicles and allow it to drive me. I would be very afraid of any level 3 vehicle on the road. So driver assist technologies, yes, a wonderful thing. But until we get to level 4, we've got some issues.
I agree with you, Rebecca. I guess what I'm saying is that some of the technologies that we have now, right, level 1 and 2, are making it possible for people with disabilities and older adults to drive that might not have otherwise been able to drive. And then,
definitely.
And then if we get to if we get to full autonomy and we make the entire trip, right? So like Aaron said, really the key is you've got to get from your bedroom to wherever you're going, right? It's fraught with both. It's tremendous opportunity, fraught with a lot of risks.
Definitely. To me, that's what I was discussing with the stopping location, that if the person doesn't know where the vehicle is going to stop and can't determine if that is a stopping location that they can get into and get out of and get from their origin starting point to the end point, then it doesn't matter whether or not they can get into the vehicle or that the vehicle drives itself. So we're in agreement completely and totally. And to me, and based on my work with the design of autonomous vehicles, that is one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I'd like to play off that. One of the things, Anne mentioned the RERC and accessible public transportation. And one of the things that we worked on very early on when we were first awarded that back in 2008 was trying to find ways to make full-size transit vehicles more accessible. This is mostly work done by our partners up at SUNY Buffalo. And they found a number of different ways of improving access into buses. For example, very little research had been done on the ramp slope. Subsequent years, that part of our team has continued to work on the problem of getting down into smaller vehicles and is now working on the shuttle-sized vehicles that transport, a handful of people in a shared ride in a fully autonomous manner. And one of the things that they're focusing heavily on right from the beginning is the vehicle design itself. And there's other research teams working on this as well. And the reason for this is the rolling stock, the vehicle itself that is used for this service, as opposed to the software and the sensors, these are typically designs that take years to develop and deploy. And so you want to get ahead of those. So while the level 4 and level 5 vehicles are just now starting to be used in daily use, so by people who have the opportunity to ride in these vehicles, the reality is that the vehicles that they're using right now are modified vehicles that existing vehicles that have been hacked to be autonomous, and these future vehicles are going to be built from the beginning to be autonomous, and those are the vehicles that we want to make sure are fully accessible from the beginning. And so there's a number of different research projects. In fact, all three of us are involved in these kinds of projects right now. And so that's why the initial focus for a lot of the autonomous vehicle research is upfront on the rolling stock, the vehicles, with the assumption that we'll be able to catch up on the software side, but we got to get these vehicles to be built from the beginning physically accessible.
And actually, an important point on that, and I apologize, is to make an autonomous vehicle accessible to everyone is the idea of a universal autonomous securement system for wheelchairs. There are currently universal securement systems for wheelchairs, but they are not autonomous. They require someone who is physically capable of securing the chair into those. They'll usually ratchet straps or something similar to that. Or there are automatic systems, but they only work for a specific wheelchair type. There have been concepts put out there, but until autonomous vehicles are designed and put these in, then wheelchair manufacturers won't make them. And until wheelchair manufacturers attach the components for these universal securement systems, the autonomous vehicle makers won't put them in. So it's a chicken and an egg conundrum.
Well, although it's perfect for the previous panel.
One quick question that I think is really important. You all are experts in this and everyone is enjoying the conversation, but can we clarify what levels 1 through 5 mean?
Yeah, I was about to jump into that. So at the lowest level, that's the manual vehicle that you drive now, right? So the next level up, as you move up the levels, more and more autonomy gets added in. So cruise control or lane keeping or so forth. And at a certain point, you start having more than one assistance system. So adaptive cruise control and lane keeping, this is what you see right now in most of the cars that bill themselves as semi-autonomous or autonomous, and that's like the Teslas and some of the other vehicles. Level 3, there's really not a level 3 vehicle on the market right now. That is still requires a driver's license and someone to make very important decisions about driving. What's likely to happen is we'll see a jump over level 3 into level 4 and 5. Practically, the differences between 4 and 5 are small, but the big detail about level 4 and 5 is that you don't actually need to drive or make decisions. And so therefore, it's about the driving task itself. And so therefore, you don't even need a steering wheel in level 4 or 5. And that looks more like, say, an autonomous, like an autonomous transit vehicle. Some of you, for example, may have ridden in the airport's train that shoots back and forth between the terminals. Imagine something like that running on city streets, but in a smaller size. That's an example of something that would be up at the level 4 or 5, except that it has no tracks and it just goes wherever it wants, and a lot slower. So really the big differences are levels 1 and 2 are kind of where we are now, and then level 4 and 5 is when you don't need a license and there's no steering wheel.
And yeah, there was a level 0 too, which is no ABS, no power steering, no.
Yeah, I'm keeping it simple. Yeah.
Yes.
So let me ask the
Those
question.
big classic cars.
Right. Let me ask the question of all of you. In the last panel, we heard about a collaboration between a community of users and an entity that provided accessible public transportation. How is the user experience being factored into the studies and the work that's going on now? And where is that voice being accessed?
So I'll kind of jump in on this, and Rory is probably going to tag team with me here. One of the things that disability researchers have found over the years that is absolutely critical is to involve people with disabilities from the beginning and continuously. This is not what you typically see in a lot of other product development communities, where the design happens in secret. Maybe they use some market research, and then they spring the product on people with very little warning. To be effective in disability work, you need to involve people with disabilities from the very beginning, because quite often the ideas that you go in with turn out to be important, but not as important as something that you didn't catch. Or there's a particular element or piece of context that is super important. So I'll give you an example. In one of the first projects we had in the RERC, and accessible public transportation was the idea of giving people with disabilities the opportunity to, with a mobile phone or a similar service, document a disability barrier that they encountered wherever they were in the city. And one of our participants, when we were working with them early on this, said, this is great, but if the bus pulls up and it's full, I can't get on and it's kind of meaningless. I need to know if the bus is going to be full. And that led us to completely change direction on this technology. And then we eventually deployed the Tiramisu Transit app, which at the time included the ability to report how full the bus was. And at the time, this was a kind of a really innovative type of thing where the people who were using the app were marking how full the bus was and then tracking the bus with their phone. And then that information was shared out to everybody else. So people could get real-time information about how far away was the bus and how full was it. And in Pittsburgh at the time, that data didn't even exist. Port Authority didn't have the equipment to do that kind of collection. The research from that is another element that I want to get at, which is universal design. And this goes back to our first panel, who talked about the importance of taking a cross-disability approach to problems. So there's excellent work that can be done with assistive technology, which focuses on a specific need, but there are other ways of tackling things that are complementary, where you kind of try and serve the needs of everybody. So for example, fullness is critical to a person who uses a wheelchair, but if you're an older adult with arthritis, that's really important to you as well. So it's not a disability specific thing. And that's why the Tiramisu app did not say, is there room for a wheelchair? It said, how full was it? And had ratings about the seat fullness. So this approach led to a widespread use here in Pittsburgh, and in our designs for that, we now see echoed in commercial products. So for example, in many cities, if you open up the Google transit information, you will see fullness ratings. And in fact, a lot of new transit systems, their information systems that are on the buses actually keep track of how full buses are and can actually compute how full the bus is based on watching people go in and out of the buses. So that early research with people with disabilities and that initial important element that was identified by one of our participants kind of has led to a very massive change in the way that transit information is provided. Rory has other examples.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Well, I guess first, if the many of you, I think you do know me, I am a person with a disability and a transportation user. So I'm leading the project, and there are several other members on our team, many of whom I'm sure you know, like John Duvall and others that are also transportation users, wheelchair users who use transportation. But we're doing many of the things that Aaron talked about, but we also are doing a large-scale survey of users, including family members and caregivers, to get an idea. We're doing a comprehensive literature review. You're all welcome to contribute to that. Now I'll throw a link in the chat in a few minutes so you can take a look at. And then we're also going to be interviewing people from Western Pennsylvania, but throughout the country as well, to do mobility mapping, just what we talked about earlier. I want to get from point A to point B. What are the barriers and facilitators, and how can autonomous vehicles and transportation systems help facilitate that? So there should be, and then in the end, we're also going to do focus groups as well. And so you're all welcome to contact me or Nikita, who's on here as well. Maybe Nikita can throw us up all, well, I guess it's only all panelists, but after this, I'll be happy to share with Anna and others my contact information if you're interested in participating, because we're literally looking for thousands of people with disabilities who use transportation to participate.
Rebecca, I'll ask you also to weigh in on this issue, because I know much of your work has dealt with the user experience and this idea of autonomy.
Yes. So, I mean, the work that I did, I similar to what Aaron and Rory have said, is that there's pulled literature and what is being done by analogous technologies, acknowledges how are people solving those problems today and such, and then interviews with individuals with disabilities as well as individuals who assist them or work with them on issues related to transportation, and then observation of individuals and how do they go about doing things. What are the things, what are their, what we call pain points that they encounter today? And as Aaron stated, trying to figure out what is the optimal solution for a good experience for everyone is the best path forward. This is universal design is the concept of doing this with individuals with disabilities, but a true human factors user experience person would consider it for everyone.
So this year we commemorated the 30th anniversary of the ADA, the passage of that. How is the work that's being done now going to shape or inform policy on a regional and a national level related to these issues?
Well, I wanted to chime in on something that Rebecca said earlier. One of the other challenges is going to be that insurance companies don't cover the cost of a wheelchair that's suitable for use as a seat in a motor vehicle. There's some exceptions, and that's the VA and for children, but that leaves out most of the VA being U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, so veterans who are eligible for VA care. And so that's going to leave out a large number, that leaves out a large portion of the population. So if you can imagine, if you have an autonomous vehicle, the most common means of tying down the wheelchair in a vehicle, right, is a 4-point restraint, basically 4 cargo straps. That's not going to be really feasible for an autonomous vehicle likely to do. And so you're going to have to come up with a better system, but then insurance companies have to cover it or largely won't be accessible. So you can see some of the challenges. So I actually wanted to challenge the panel before us. We need their help to solve that problem, right? This is the access problem of the 1960s today, is getting insurance coverage for tie down to occupant restraint systems. That's the other challenge is, the occupant restraints, fancy name for seat belt, lap belt and shoulder harness. But if you can't engage that yourself, how are you going to do that if there's no one there to help you?
This comes into play also with the payment for the ride itself. So if you're using a shared ride and it's not, it's kind of a government furnished ride, through some of the mechanisms that we have, for example, you may have a really hard time. There might be a service that will get you there, but you can't afford it because you don't have the people who will pay for your kinds of rides won't pay for that kind of ride, or they'd be willing to, but there's no mechanism to get the payment to the people who are providing the service. And so there's a lot of problems with this notion of how do you get the money to the right place, to the right people, with the least amount of pain. And this is a very complicated policy problem that thankfully I'm not going to solve because I'm an engineer, but the people who work in public policy and finance and government accounting and so forth are going to have to work with the providers, especially the private providers, to figure out how to get the money to the right place so the person gets the ride they need. There's another element that kind of has been lingering since the early days of accessibility that hasn't gone away yet either. So for those of you who live a little farther out, you may notice that there'll be a Port Authority bus stop, and that stop will have a paved area and maybe even a bus shelter, but there'll be no sidewalk going to it. And the reason for that is that the sidewalks for that neighborhood and the sidewalks to that bus stop are managed and funded by that local municipality. And so Port Authority can try to provide accessible service, but a local municipality, their decision-making and the way they've prioritized their finances can render that stop meaningless to a person with a disability.
So one of my questions is, a lot of this research is going on in the academy, but it's also happening in private corporations and with the intersection with national government funding. How do those collaborations work? How do they come together to affect the best possible solutions for the future?
Rebecca looks like she wants to say something.
It's always interesting when you have for-profit businesses and government. I've worked on both sides of the fence, trying to work together on such. There are consortiums that exist working on the problems, though a lot of times they're focusing on the design. The ones that I'm most familiar with, I should say, are focused on the design problems, which are huge and do need to be addressed. But as Erin and Rory have pointed out, there's also all of these other challenges associated, and it's going to be a long road with a lot of sausage making.
Well, I think on one side, I think a lot of the automobile industry believes that this is a way to capture a larger market, and so there is interest from the private sector in that regard. And there's interest from various federal agencies, of course. Department of Transportation is very interested in this area because that's what they do, right? That's what they regulate. The thing that has to be here is that someone's like, CMS, right? Medicare services. They, in some ways, they're not at the table, but they need to be in some ways, because it's one of these challenging problems. It's not only vehicle, and it's not just the vehicle, it's not just the roads, it's the technology that people use themselves and may or may not be covered by insurance. So those are other sort of challenging things. And then the tech companies as well, right? Because you need the Googles of the world to be engaged as well, so they can help with the route planning and the access and the communication and all of that. So I guess on the positive, this symposium is taking place at the right time because we're at a very early stage.
Yeah. So I do want to point out, though, that as you asked about the partnerships between the government and academia and industry, I do want to point out that this is actually a model, as Rory said, that Department of Transportation at the US level does spend a lot of effort and time on. And there is a program underway right now that is less focused on autonomous vehicles and more focused on everything else about the complete trip, called the Accessible Transportation Technologies Research Initiative. We all call this ATTRI, A-T-T-R-I. I actually see the name of someone from USDOT in the list here who's involved in that program on the attendees list. And I bring this up because not only because our team has had some funding in this space, but there are companies here in Pittsburgh that have strong ties to University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon that are also funded to work on specific problems in this area. So for example, there's a Pitt spin-out called PathView that's been working on the problem of knowing whether or not a sidewalk is accessible. And so they've been working with on a USDOT project on that. There's also a project looking at making signal lights safer and more accessible for people who are blind and low vision and other disabilities by having smartphones talk to lights. And so some of you know that there are lights in parts of the city that are, there's research projects going with Carnegie Mellon and SureTrack, the spin-out company. And then that project is part of that. And then our project that we're funded on to look at the task of making a transfer or moving around inside a transportation hub. One of the partners involved in this is IBM, and they have been collaborating with members of our team to do some really interesting research on helping people who are blind move through transit hubs with assistance from things like robot suitcases and and computer vision techniques. In fact, there was an ad by IBM that involved Cheiko Asakawa that was played heavily during football games and other things. And it shows her going to the airport. That ad was filmed here in Pittsburgh. And if you know what to look for, you will spot like pieces of Carnegie Mellon's campus and elements from around Pittsburgh. They didn't mention Pittsburgh anywhere in the ad, but you know. My point though is that there's already a lot of work going on in this area in terms of looking at future technologies and involving academia, government, and industry. And in fact, Pittsburgh is one of the places where a lot of that work is actually happening.
I guess I'd like to chime in. The other thing is where the government and industry and academia all really work closely together is standards.
Yes.
Right. I mean, all the way from the access board standards to Department of Transportation standards to ANSI and SAE standards, all kinds of federal standards and voluntary standards are critical for that public-private academic partnership development as well. Also, one thing that we haven't really talked about, I want to throw out there that's pretty interesting is that there are now companies, because there is currently a gap in personal transportation that's autonomous or semi-autonomous. So there's companies like Whirlwind Mobility who are working to take the vehicles like you might already have, like in a wheelchair accessible van, and convert them to be autonomous vehicles. So it's kind of a bridge type of technology as well. So there, corporations are looking at this from different angles.
So that leads me, Rory, to a question that maybe we'll close with and then get to some of the Q&A from the audience is, we talk about the future of accessible transportation and autonomy. Sounds like the future in some cases is now, but Aaron, earlier you alluded to the future, a little bit of the future is now, that the true future for autonomy is in the distance. How far in the distance? What are we looking at in terms of the R&D and then real life experience with these technologies?
So Waymo has been running a test in Phoenix, Arizona, which, speaking as a robotics person who's done who's actually driven autonomous vehicles, is probably the easiest place to do vehicle autonomy. But they have actually opened up their field test today, either today or yesterday. They announced that they're going to let people start, who are not part of their closed test, start to get rides in their vehicles. If you remember when Uber was running their vehicles in service here in Pittsburgh, they were also providing opportunities for the general public to get rides. But again, these are always vehicles that are modified to be autonomous and are not built from scratch to be autonomous. And so as a result, they quite often aren't accessible on the physical front. So I think there's two ways to think about this. There's that personal vehicle, the vehicle where it's your vehicle or you have least time on it and it takes you where you want to go by yourself. Those vehicles, that is the billion-dollar question. Nobody has a good answer on that. Now, if you're talking about a smaller shuttle vehicle that operates in a neighborhood and drives around in an area and serves anybody who calls it, and 4 or 5 people can ride in it, these vehicles have already been deployed in a number of different places around the world in service. They tend to move very slow, but these vehicles are out there. That is probably a lot sooner. But the catch is where and how they're deployed is going to be very targeted, because there are certain requirements for these kinds of vehicles to operate.
Just piggyback on that, even though Waymo has opened up theirs and they operated in the suburbs of Phoenix, it still has a safety driver, and right. It is not clear when that safety driver is going to go away. And in terms of personally owned, that's decades away. These vehicles are going to be prohibitively expensive for quite a long period of time. And the maintenance on the sensors and the features is going to be much more intricate than your standard automobile. Taking it in for an oil change every 3,000 miles and, you know, and such. You're going to have to stick to a much tighter maintenance schedule on it, more like the FAA with commercial airplanes. So having it be personally owned is many, many years away, except for the ultra rich.
So I actually have a little bit a slightly different perspective, similar but slightly different. One, I think two things have to happen. People have to be willing to give up their cars and get off the road themselves. And so, believe it or not, it sounds like a joke, but Sweden, you know, they switched from driving on the left side of the road to the right side of the road, right? And that's kind of what this was decades ago, but that's kind of what we're going to have to do at some point. And I think insurance companies are going to drive this, and they're going to say, you know what, you're done. People got to get off the road now. And so that's part of the, I think, so there's going to have to be a cultural shift as well as a technological shift, I think, as well in this as well. And then I think when that happens, we'll probably less be owning cars. We'll be sharing cars. Unless you really, really travel a lot, there might not be any benefit to owning a car per se, right? You could share it with a group of people, or you could buy it into a service, but I think there'll be entirely new models about ownership, right?
Right, and one of the things we're seeing in just regular cars is for the younger generation, they're getting licenses at a much later rate, so a much slower rate, much later in their lives, and a lot of younger people are not buying cars. That car ownership is moving back as well. So I think Rory is correct in that we're going to be seeing this evolution in what transportation means in the United States. And interestingly, a lot of the auto companies, they actually don't view themselves as auto companies anymore. They view themselves as transportation service providers. It's just that the service that they're providing is different than, say, a transit vehicle or a paratransit vehicle.
Thank you to you all. I'm going to invite Mary Ruth. I see we do have some questions in the chat to share some of those questions with our panelists.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, you were able to forecast a lot of those questions. So many of them have been answered in terms of thinking about universal design and cost, and obviously the economic disparities. And as you mentioned, the fact that this is something that isn't going to be personally attainable for a very long time. But something to think about that I think connects the two panels is the ways that you design for a range of disabilities. So in our first panel, they talked about needing to collectively band across a range of disabilities and be able to think about everything that people needed in that space. How does that happen with autonomy, particularly with something like someone that is visually impaired, which is quite a different scenario in that total journey, that complete journey, than what you might have described for someone who's a wheelchair user?
Yeah, so interestingly, going to fully autonomous rideshare vehicles, you know, so right now there's Uber, Lyft, and whatnot. Going to a fully autonomous vehicle might actually really improve their experience. One of the chronic problems with a lot of these ride-sharing services is people who are blind and low vision being discriminated against, where a driver will pretend that they're a no-show, or they'll see the dog on the street, the guide dog on the street, and they'll do something because they don't want the dog in their car. Uber and Lyft have very strict policies about not doing these things, and yet it keeps happening. And so if you don't have a person in the vehicle making these sorts of discriminatory decisions, that problem becomes a lot less of a problem. Having said that, there's still the challenge of the rendezvous of a person who's blind or low vision finding the right vehicle. You heard Holly talk about trying to find the right bus. The same thing is true for a shared vehicle that comes to get you. And I have a student. I have a student on my team trying to solve this problem with robots. It's the same problem with vehicles, and we think this is a thing that can be solved and will be solved by the time these vehicles come on the market. So again, ironically, autonomy may actually remove some of the reasons for the discrimination we see in the comparable services now.
One of the fascinating things about it is smartphones, which we would think of as not being accessible, are one of the most accessible pieces of technology out there. And what makes them accessible is that if you go into the accessibility settings, you can turn on or turn off different functions. And this makes it so a person with vision impairments, that run the gamut, can use the phone as well as a sighted person. A person with hearing impairments uses it not necessarily for the phone function, but it allows them to do ASL much more easily than other methods. They don't have to be linked to their desktop anymore. But this is all done sort of by having those customizable features that you can turn on and turn off based on your specific preferences and needs. And so this is another part of that, designing into the software ahead of time and being thoughtful about it and saying, what are the range of things that people need to consider, and how can I make those things, what can I do so that I can create a customizable experience for those individuals? It gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about a service versus your own personalized car and things being switched between riders, but it is a solvable problem.
Well, I also want to make sure we don't miss out on people who are cognitively impaired as well, right? That they, rely heavily on the driver and on public transportation, and we want to make sure as we move forward with autonomous vehicles. I do think the smartphone is a good analogy. If the vehicle is not only autonomous but also smart, then it should start to remember your profile, or the service remembers your profile. The way I think about it is, when you go and buy a smartphone, when you take it out of the box, it's the same smartphone as everybody else that just bought a smartphone. But within a month, it is your smartphone, right? It is completely different than the thing you bought a month before. And with cloud computing, right, connected computing, there's no reason that your experience with the vehicle can't be your experience with the vehicle in a fairly short amount of time.
So this brings up something I forgot to mention earlier, is that while we will likely see a lot of vehicles have no drivers in them, there may be a portion of the vehicles in Allegheny County that, the shared vehicles, where there is someone on it working for that service, but they're not driving. Instead, they're providing other forms of customer service, bringing a person to and from a door, helping carry groceries or something like that. They may even just be doing on the phone customer service for people who are in other vehicles when they're not needed in their vehicles. So there's this opportunity, when you free up the person in the vehicle from driving, to provide all sorts of other kinds of service. So a person with a cognitive disability might be able to specify, I really want to be in a vehicle that has one of these attendants or these customer service people. So these are the sorts of innovative, crazy new models that become possible with technology and autonomy. And we're just now starting to see people play with these ideas and see which ones work and which ones don't.
Eric brings up a great point too, because that's the model that airplanes use today in many ways, right? So you could also be having, these people could be delivering packages or groceries, as well as assisting people with disabilities. It'd just be a different compartment or different section of the vehicle. Just like when you fly on an airplane, there's luggage and cargo in that airplane, as well as passengers in that airplane. There's different people servicing different parts of that aircraft. So you could have a vehicle that's delivering groceries and helping people with disabilities or older adults move around as well.
So I have one last question for you guys, and then we're going to bring our first panelist back as well to ask kind of a larger wrap-up question that kind of connects the two. And the question, in terms of thinking about the future, We know that some of the accessibility features, like you mentioned smartphones, that benefits everyone. Some of the pieces, things like speech to text, curb cuts, these all benefit every person, right? ADA doesn't just benefit people with disabilities. So how going forward do you think some of these pieces that you've been describing in the future of design would be beneficial to everyone as we move forward?
So every time someone asks me, you know, what is the killer app of autonomous vehicles? And I say, it's taking the kids to soccer practice without the parents. You know, if you live in the suburbs, you understand the logistics of getting kids around the place, or getting around, right? And if you can handle kids, you can probably do a pretty good job with a large number of other people, right? It's the universal design problem, but it's coming at it from children instead of people with disabilities. And so I think that a lot of the things that we are worried about now in terms of people with disabilities, in terms of, you know, for example, you want to have a really simplified experience for someone who might have a cognitive disability, you're going to need that experience for the kids too, right? You know, so there's a lot of these kind of core basic capability questions that have value in a lot of other communities that will want these services too. Now, the nuance here is, of course, is that these sorts of services, these sorts of other communities can swamp the demand and essentially remove that from people with disabilities. We see this in some cities where the accessible taxis, you can never get one because they're all out at the airport because they're big enough to transport everybody's luggage, right? So these are the sorts of trade-offs and tensions that public policymakers are going to have to pay very close attention to, because in general, when universal design is, which is what you're talking about, is introduced, you do typically see a very strong demand from across the community, not just people with disabilities, and public policy people sometimes miss that.
So I'd say the killer app is actually drops your groceries off and takes your kids to soccer practice, right? You know, so I actually think it has opportunities too, because maybe the vehicle, maybe your neighbor, you know, tells your neighbor and they get paid $2 to deliver your groceries to your house, right? So I think there's some really interesting opportunities if you're going to, just like picking up your kid, you know, right now where families carpool to get kids back and forth around the share, sort of ride share. You could do combinations, I think, of human and autonomous vehicles working together, or maybe it's a robot that deploys and drops the groceries off, and the kids run out and get in the car, right? But
sorry, Rory.
Yeah, because I think there's a commercial side to this that also makes it a little more attractive, right?
So for me, the killer app, my son is much younger and not ready for soccer and such, is the fact that I can actually focus on him. And I don't have, if it's designed for somebody with cognitive disabilities, I can still get into the vehicle while I'm paying attention to him and making sure he's not running into traffic. I can be in the car with him and spend that time focused on him and not driving and trying to split my attention between his demands for attention. So there are tons of benefits for this technology when it comes to fruition.
Those all sound like amazing opportunities. I'm going to ask for Paul and Holly to join us again with your videos. There's a series of questions that I think we can wrap up together for everyone, which is really thinking about the ways that advocacy moves forward now. And you all did a wonderful job in the first panel of helping us understand that journey of advocacy from where we were basically starting from no accessible transportation. And now we've heard about what the future of that might look like and kind of where we are in the moment. But what does advocacy look like now as we move forward in terms of accessible transportation? What do we need advocates for as we move into the future? And who do we need helping to do that work? If you guys could respond to that as our final question, I think that would answer a lot of the questions that we've had towards the end of the program.
One of the things that occurred to me when I think Aaron was talking about what I call the island bus stop that, you know, sits in the middle of nowhere, is that that's what's at stake right now with the whole BRT process. That, you know, when I think of an autonomous vehicle, the person I think of is Rich McGann, who's deaf and blind, and his sense of what an autonomous vehicle offers him is an unimaginable independence. But it would be necessary that for that vehicle, for example, to be able to guide Rich into the building. So you'd have to be within sight of the building entrance. Now, if the whole stretch of Fifth Avenue and Forbes Avenue is something that that vehicle can't pull over and pick him up or discharge, then that makes that, you know, unavailable to him. And so I think that what I see is that it's not enough to develop the possibility for accessible transportation. It's important to make sure that as development changes, that you don't accidentally break it or make it impossible, you know, a desert of accessibility because there wasn't foresight about it, you know, the constituent needs of each system. So that was one of the things I guess I noticed as, you know, kind of like one of the connections between advocacy, technology, both present and future.
Thanks, Paul. Anyone else can jump in. It's okay.
For me,
What? Somebody.
Holly, did you want to go next?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody said. Yeah, I said all that really shows your ability to put yourself in the shoes of someone else and look at someone else's needs. So you always do that very well. I think it's really important that we have somebody with people with all kinds of different disabilities sitting down together when we're discussing these kinds of things in planning sessions, because strange things come up. You know, and the average person doesn't think of a person who's deaf and blind. And I worked with Rich McGann, the man he was talking about, for many years, and he taught me a great deal. And I think we can learn so much from each other in working together. And you can never forget, you know, the need for everybody working together.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to emphasize, so I'm not from Pittsburgh. Like I came here back in 2001. And I have done, prior to that, I was working in other states and other places with other transit systems and other municipalities. And one thing that we have here in Allegheny County that is, in my opinion, really amazing and really unique is, and this is reflected in the early days of Access and Magic Carpet and work with Port Authority during the ADA initiation, is that we are very fortunate in that our service providers, our government stakeholders, our government representatives, our local foundations, there's a real mentality here in Pittsburgh of let's figure this out. This is a problem. It can be solved. There are pragmatic solutions to this. We don't need to get in fights with each other. We can just get in a room and like hash this out and figure out what the right solution is. And that sort of partnerships between all the different constituencies, it's very unusual to see that in a metro region like we have. And this is the sort of kind of respectful, reasonable kind of let's solve this problem from a pragmatic perspective approach that the advocates that have come before us have done a really good job of instilling in our community. And that's something that we need to really carry forward. We have a real opportunity to get a lot of really interesting things done because of the groundwork that they laid and the practices that they established within the community.
This is Karen. If I could add just from an agency point of view, I think the distinguishing qualities of the advocates from the beginning have been their level of respect for each other and the institutions they're working with, their reasonableness, their relentlessness. I mean, they did not go away. They never gave up. They kept on coming. And the fact that they educated themselves on the topics. They didn't dig their heels in and demand for things that would benefit them and not each other. And they often made sacrifices to accomplish a greater goal. So having that larger goal as a target all the time really helped move things forward and enabled long-term success.
I think that's an excellent point. That I mean, when you're talking about the design of autonomous vehicles moving forward to make them accessible, people are going to have to continue to advocate and say that there are a market for it, but they're also going to have to understand the constraints and the system, what can and can't be done when you're talking about a vehicle design. And as Aaron mentioned, the long timeline for a vehicle design, and coming with the idea that I'm not going to get everything that I want, but let's find the optimal solution going forward. And that persistence of just moving that ball up that up the hill inch by inch.
Wonderful. And Rory, do you want to add anything before we?
I just think a hallmark of Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania is collaboration between the people with disabilities working together, the foundations, the academia, government, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're doing this work in Pittsburgh, if you think about it. I mean, to use a boxing analogy, Pittsburgh punches way above its weight. Right? We contribute a lot more than you would expect for a city of this, or a region of this size.
And I like to point out, we have crazy terrain, crazy roads, all four seasons, all types of buildings, historic buildings. So as I like to say to people, if you can solve a transportation problem here in Pittsburgh, you can do it anywhere.
And you can have all four seasons one day.
Yeah.
And perhaps we can show the federal government something that we've done for many years that it doesn't seem to be able to do right now.
I think that's a wonderful way for us to wrap up in terms of reflecting the ways that this community has uniquely championed relentlessly over years for the rights of everyone, and also the ways that our city and region continues to contribute to this national, even global effort to make sure that transportation is accessible for all in the future. Thank you all to our panelists for joining us this evening, to our wonderful partners with the Disability History and Action Consortium, and to our funders, the Edith L. Trees Trust, FISA Foundation, and we look forward to seeing you all at a future event with the History Center, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Stay well, and we will see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.